In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi had been ruling Libya for more than 40 years. He had survived coups, international sanctions, and several wars. But in the final months of his life, everything suddenly changed. Chaos erupted throughout Libya, and the cities became war zones. In this video, I will tell you the entire life story of Gaddafi up to the end of his life. Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a desert camp near the town of Sirte, Libya. He came from a poor Bedouin family, people who are nomads in the desert. As a young man, he joined the military and studied in Libya before being sent to the United Kingdom for further training. In 1969, at the age of 27, he led a coup against King Idris. It was a major uprising, and when the king fell, he took full control of the country. From then on, he held power tightly. He abolished the monarchy, closed the American and British military bases, and nationalized the oil industry. He created his own political system, which he called Jamahiriya, which supposedly gave power to the people. But in reality, all the control still ended up with him. By the 70s and 80s, Gaddafi was known around the world as a leader with radical ideas and connections to armed groups fighting in different countries. He was implicated in terrorist attacks, including the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 in Lockerbie, Scotland, which killed 270 people. Because of this, Libya was subjected to severe economic sanctions and international restrictions for many years. However, Gaddafi also tried to present himself as a pan-African and pan-Arab leader. He wanted to unite the countries in Africa and be a voice against the West. By the 2000s, he began to soften his image. He stopped the weapons programs, reopened relations with Western countries, and tried to revive Libya's economy. But within the country itself, the anger of the citizens was growing. The government had strict control. There were no political parties, no freedom of speech, and corruption was widespread. The wealth from oil only went to the few who were in power. Gaddafi and his family lived in luxury, while most Libyans suffered. So in February 2011, when protests broke out, it was no longer surprising. In Benghazi, the second largest city in Libya, the people joined the protests inspired by the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, where leaders were also overthrown. This movement was called the Arab Spring, a large-scale resistance against dictators in the Middle East and North Africa. In Libya, this kind of event started on February 15, when families of political prisoners gathered in front of a police station to demand the release of human rights lawyer Fathi Terbil. He was arrested that day after speaking about the Abu Salim prison massacre in 1996, where more than 1,200 prisoners were killed by Gaddafi's men. The protest movement grew rapidly. By February 17th, which they called the Day of Rage, thousands of Libyans had taken to the streets of Benghazi, Baida, Tobruk, and Derna. They were angry at 4 decades of dictatorship, poverty, and oppression. Instead of allowing them to express themselves peacefully, they were fired upon by security forces, including the Internal Security Agency and members of the revolutionary committees. According to reports from hospitals, more than 230 people were killed in just 4 days. Most were shot in the head and chest, proof that live ammunition was used against civilians. The government even sent additional troops and stationed snipers on rooftops. On state media, Gaddafi blamed foreign agents and claimed that the youth involved were either drunk or high on illegal drugs. His son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, also appeared on television, warning of rivers of blood if the protesters did not stop. The more the government tried to suppress the protests, the more people joined the resistance. By the last week of February, some of the strongest military units began to defect. In the city of Benghazi, some soldiers refused to shoot at civilians. The 36th Brigade, led by Major General Suleiman Mahmoud, fought against the very regime they once served, and they helped the rebels take control of the city. Several government buildings were burned, police precincts were seized, and weapons were stolen from military camps. By February 24th, almost the entire eastern part of Libya was not under Gaddafi's control. In the cities of Tobruk, Misrata, Baida, and Zawiya, fierce clashes continued. The former protesters are now armed, using guns they obtained from abandoned military bases. Even some pilots from Gaddafi's air force refused orders to bomb their own cities. Instead, they flew to Malta to seek asylum. Amidst the chaos, the opposition began to unite. On February 27, the National Transitional Council, or NTC, was officially formed in Benghazi. Under the leadership of former Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil, they became the representatives of the revolutionary forces and began to plan for a new Libya, a country without Gaddafi. Meanwhile, Gaddafi still maintained a tight grip on Tripoli and its neighboring regions in the western part of the country. On his side were selected units such as the Qamis Brigade led by his son, Qamis Gaddafi. They had heavy weapons, tanks, and artillery. In addition, Gaddafi also hired foreign mercenaries from Chad, Mali, and Niger to completely suppress the rebels. By the first week of March 2011, the situation had reached a critical level. Gaddafi's army used all heavy weapons, tanks, cannons, and even airstrikes to retake the cities held by the rebels. Civilians were bombed, especially in the cities of Benghazi and Ajdabiya in the east. Terrifying images of houses and buildings destroyed by the bombings appeared in international news. And gradually, fear spread that if Gaddafi reached Benghazi, a massive massacre would happen. On March 12, the Arab League held an emergency meeting. They issued a call for a no-fly zone, a move that gave official support from Arab countries for the rebels. At the same time, France and the United Kingdom led the call for the United Nations to take action. And on March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, with 10 countries voting in favor while others abstained. Meanwhile, 5 abstained, including Russia and China. The use of all necessary measures was authorized to protect civilians, including the implementation of a no-fly zone and the prohibition of all flights in Libya that could be used for military operations. The order also included an immediate ceasefire on both sides. Just 2 days later, on March 19, the airstrikes began. This was led by a coalition of countries such as the United States, France, United Kingdom, and Canada. The first targets of the missiles were Gaddafi's military air defense systems, radar stations, and communication centers. More than 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from U.S. and U.K. ships in the Mediterranean Sea. Meanwhile, French fighter jets attacked and destroyed tanks heading to or in Benghazi. The first phase of the operation was called Operation Odyssey Dawn, which aimed to prevent Gaddafi from attacking civilians, especially in areas held by the rebels. By March 23, NATO had taken full command of the offensives. Under the new mission called Operation Unified Protector, 28 NATO members and several non-NATO partners, such as Qatar, UAE, and Jordan, participated. The airstrikes quickly produced results. In just a few days, a large part of Gaddafi's armed forces was almost destroyed. NATO targeted the MiG-23 fighter jets, Sukhoi bombers, and even the air bases. After this, they also blew up the long-range rocket launchers, supply convoys, and command centers used by the regime. In just the first 2 weeks of the operation, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles were wiped off the map, especially around Misrata and Zintan, where the fighting was intense. Meanwhile, at sea, the arms embargo was strictly enforced to prevent weapons from reaching Gaddafi's troops. Coalition warships were patrolling along the coast of Libya, and inspecting every ship suspected of carrying military supplies. But even though his army was almost crushed, Gaddafi remained defiant. He continued to speak through state television, accusing NATO of wanting to reoccupy Libya. He called them rats and rebels and threatened to cleanse the country street by street. According to him, foreign countries only want to steal Libya's oil and interfere in Libya's internal affairs. His soldiers tried to shoot down NATO planes using Russian-made surface-to-air missiles. But this did not even disrupt the relentless bombing. By mid-2011, the tide of the battle gradually turned because NATO continued to target supply routes, weapons depots, and command centers, weakening Gaddafi's forces. From three directions, the Western Mountains, the Misrata Front, and the east of Libya, the rebel forces began to move toward the capital. And on August 20, 2011, the rebels launched their final offensive, which they called Operation Mermaid Dawn. It was a carefully planned operation that combined secret forces who had been deployed in the city weeks before the attack. On that day, they moved simultaneously from inside Tripoli, while armed convoys approached from outside the city. For 5 days, the capital was engulfed in intense fighting. In the districts of Tajura, Pashlum, and Souk al-Jumah, battles broke out that seemed endless. Those loyal to Gaddafi tried to defend their positions using snipers and tanks, but they were overwhelmed by the speed and number of the rebels. Many of the government's soldiers surrendered, while others simply abandoned their barricades. On August 23rd, the rebels finally stormed Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's long-standing and heavily guarded stronghold in the heart of Tripoli. For more than 4 decades, it served as the heart of his rule. It was fortified with thick concrete walls, bunkers, and underground tunnels. A true symbol of power that has now completely collapsed in the midst of war. Inside the compound, the rebels found all sorts of luxuries, weapons, documents, and expensive items left behind in haste. But the one they were looking for the most, Muammar Gaddafi, was gone. As Tripoli was falling, he had already escaped. According to intelligence reports, he left the capital before the final battle broke out, possibly on August 19th or 20th. He was moving in secret, transferring from one safe hiding place to another with the help of tribes that remained loyal to him. At the same time, his family also fled. On August 29th, his wife Safia Farkash, his daughter Aisha, and his sons Hannibal and Muhammad crossed over to Algeria. There, they were given temporary shelter. Another one of his sons, Saadi Gaddafi, escaped to Niger, where he was later arrested by the authorities. But Gaddafi himself refused to leave Libya. For him, leaving the country was a sign of complete defeat. Instead, he chose to hide in areas still controlled by tribes loyal to him, especially around his hometown of Sirte. Sirte is located on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, about 450 kilometers from Tripoli and almost 570 kilometers. Gaddafi had a deep connection to this city. It wasn't just his hometown. He built some of his most ambitious projects here. Wide roads, modern buildings, and government agencies. This is also where the meetings of the African Union were held. And he once again expressed his dream of turning the continent into the United States of Africa, with Sirte itself as the capital. By the first week of September 2011, he arrived in Sirte, together with a few remaining loyal soldiers, staff, and members of his tribe, the Gaddafi. 2 of his sons, Mutasim, a military commander, and Saif al-Islam, whom he considered his political heir, were also believed to be hiding around the city. Since the fall of Tripoli, Sirte was the only remaining bastion of his power. Communication was cut off, supplies were running low, but he still refused to surrender. He didn't want to leave the country he himself had shaped for more than 4 decades. By the second week of September, the forces of the National Transitional Council began their assault on Sirte. At this point, many countries had already recognized the NTC as the official government of Libya. Thousands of fighters from different brigades were sent to capture the city. Units from Misrata, Benghazi, and Zintan moved simultaneously from the east and west with a single objective: capture Gaddafi and end the war. The rebels expected the battle to be quick, but the loyalists put up a fierce defense. Snipers and artillery units hid inside buildings, houses, schools, and even hospitals. The roads were rigged with landmines and improvised explosive devices. Since mid-September, the NTC has been continuously shelling the city. Every day, buildings are bombarded by Grad rockets, mortars, and tanks. At the same time, NATO aircraft continue to bomb targets such as bunkers and command centers. Civilians tried to escape, but many were trapped inside Sirte as the city's infrastructure gradually collapsed. As the situation worsened, Gaddafi and his group continued to hide in abandoned houses and underground tunnels. He no longer had a clear command structure, and the morale of his men was also low. But he continued to give orders to fight until the end. His son, Mutasim, oversaw the defense of the city and led the final attempt to drive back the incoming rebels. By the last week of September, Sirte was completely surrounded. The NTC already controlled the outskirts and was gradually advancing toward the city center, block by block, house by house, street by street. Every meter was paid for with blood. Thousands of fighters died on both sides. Meanwhile, in the sky, NATO spy planes were constantly flying overhead. They moved from place to place, searching for any sign of where the man long considered the king of the desert was hiding. While the fighting continued in Sirte, NATO forces used their surveillance jets to monitor every movement in the city. Using heat signatures and radio signals, they tracked every possible hiding place of Gaddafi. Because of this, he strictly ordered his group not to use any phones, radios, or electronic devices. The few satellite phones they had were rarely turned on, and most of the time, they just relied on runners. These were people who ran around the city to deliver messages to different hideouts. Electricity and water had also been cut off. The group survived on canned goods, dried food, and whatever supplies they could get from damaged stores or from civilians who remained loyal to Gaddafi. There was almost no medicine left. The wounded soldiers were treated using only simple equipment, and they were running very low on antibiotics. Many of them gradually got sick due to hunger, thirst, and unsanitary conditions. At this time, it was estimated that only about 200 fighters remained loyal to him. Most of them were fellow countrymen from his own tribe and neighboring towns. They served as Gaddafi's last line of defense. They formed a small convoy that always surrounded him whenever he moved. Included in this group was Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, the defense minister of Libya, one of the last pillars of his administration. According to witnesses and reports that came out after the war, it was clear that Gaddafi's health had already deteriorated. He had lost a lot of weight, looked pale, and was obviously tired. He was no longer the strong and arrogant leader who used to be seen on television. As his beard grew longer, it turned white like ash. There were reports that he was suffering from high blood pressure, mild diabetes, and extreme stress. But even in this condition, he still did not waver. He refused to surrender or leave Libya unless he was forced to. After Tripoli fell, he also stopped making public statements. There were no more speeches on state television, no more shouts of revolution. He knew that any sign of his location could result in a NATO airstrike, so he stayed silent, a quiet tactic to confuse the world. He wanted everyone to think that he might have been killed, or maybe he had escaped to another country. But behind the silence, he still had a plan. His goal was to slip through the siege of Sirte and escape to the south, possibly to the city of Saba in the middle of the desert. or perhaps cross over to Niger, where some of his men had already escaped. But the rebels were closely guarding every road out of the city. The roads were full of checkpoints. Convoys trying to get out were ambushed or forced to turn back. There was no safe route left, nowhere to hide. His group became even more desperate. They learned to sleep in shifts. Some kept watch while others rested. They used sandbags and debris to block the passageways and hide their vehicles from the drone's view. But even so, their movements and daily lives were still limited. The chains of war tightened even more. By mid-October 2011, it was clear that they could no longer defend Sirte. So on October 19th, Gaddafi decided to try to escape. That night, they began preparations. They formed a convoy of more than 50 vehicles. Most of them were pickup trucks and SUVs, equipped with machine guns or anti-aircraft weapons. Some were loaded with bullets and weapons, while others were carrying his men and personal staff. Included in the convoy were Mu'tasim Gaddafi, Abu Bakr, Yunus Jabr, and Mansour Dao, his chief of security, as well as several high-ranking military officials and some relatives. It was a dangerous plan, but they had no other choice. To avoid NATO's eyes, they would leave in the middle of the night. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, October 19th, the convoy slowly moved out from their hiding place in the city. No headlights, no noise. They passed between buildings and trees, hoping the darkness would cover their escape. The goal of Gaddafi's group was to get out of Sirte, take the desert road to Wadi Zamzam, and from there head to Saba, where they planned to cross over to Niger or Algeria. But they didn't know that for weeks, NATO surveillance drones had been constantly monitoring Sirte. The agents from America and France were patiently monitoring and observing any unusual movements in the area, hoping they would pinpoint the exact moment of Gaddafi's escape. And that night finally came. A U.S. MQ-1 Predator drone flying high above the skies of Sirte detected unusual heat signatures. A convoy slowly leaving the city in the middle of the darkness. By dawn on October 20th, while the convoy was on the western side of Sirte, the observers once again confirmed their location. At around 8:30 in the morning, NATO launched the final move. From a distant base, a Predator drone fired a Hellfire missile that hit one of the lead vehicles in the convoy. In an instant, the entire column stopped. The front burst into flames, and the rear was suddenly struck by French Mirage jets with laser-guided bombs. Several vehicles exploded and others overturned as they desperately tried to escape the successive explosions. In the midst of the chaos, many of Gaddafi's men were killed instantly. Some ran away bleeding, while the survivors, including Gaddafi, Mu'tasim, and Mansour Dao, hurried to take shelter in a large drainage pipe at the side of the road, about 4 feet wide, just enough for a few people to squeeze in. They stayed there silent and hiding in the dark, hoping they wouldn't be found. But after a short while, the rebels arrived. From Misrata, they had been following the convoy for a long time, and when they heard the explosions, they immediately headed in the direction of the smoke. They were carrying rifles, grenades, and light machine guns. They patiently searched every destroyed building and scattered vehicle until they noticed traces of blood and footprints leading to a drain. They threw a grenade first and then slowly approached to take a look. There, they saw the former powerful dictator kneeling inside the pipe, wearing brown pants, a bloodied shirt, and a flak vest. His face was almost unrecognizable because of the dirt and blood. He had wounds on his arm, back, and leg, most likely from metal fragments that hit him during the airstrike. He was dragged out and exposed to the sunlight. He could barely stand. After a short while, Mu'tasim Gaddafi was also captured, followed by Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, who was badly wounded. Were killed or captured nearby. According to Mansour Dao, one of those taken alive, Gaddafi really tried to escape towards the canal before they were bombed. The rebels brought Gaddafi in a pickup truck. As it moved, people were shouting, He was passed around, his hair was pulled, he was punched, kicked, and hit with guns and sticks. Some were shouting angry words, grievances from people who suffered under the dictatorship, torture, and waiting. Rebels venting their anger against their own people. As more rebels gathered around, the situation became even more chaotic. In the videos that surfaced afterwards, Gaddafi could be seen slumped over, his head and body covered in blood, while people tried to force him into a vehicle. He tried to get up several times but was forced down again. The anger of the people could no longer be controlled. Until now, the exact moment of his death is still uncertain. According to medical reports, he was hit by a bullet in the head and chest. Some say this was an accident in the midst of the chaos, but many also believe that someone really shot him on purpose. There was no trial, no official punishment. It was a sudden end to 14 decades of leadership. When the truck reached the checkpoint of the National Transitional Council, Muammar Gaddafi was already dead. He was nearly unrecognizable, covered in blood with torn clothes. Doctors declared that he passed away around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, October 20, 2011, at the age of 69. His body was brought to the city of Misrata, a place that had taken severe revenge for the years of his rule. For 3 days, his body was placed inside a refrigerated meat locker at the market, where thousands of people lined up to see him, the former king of Libya, now just a corpse. For some, that was justice. There was more revenge. The bodies of Mu'tasim Gaddafi and Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, who both died a few hours after being captured, were also brought to Misrata. On October 23, 3 days after his death, the National Transitional Council officially declared the end of the Libyan civil war. After more than 8 months of fighting and over 30,000 deaths, a new chapter for Libya began. But his final resting place remained a mystery. On the night of October 25, 2011, Gaddafi was buried in a secret location in the desert of western Libya. Until now, no one is certain where his body is buried. And in this way, the life of Muammar Gaddafi ended, a man who ruled with an iron fist and died at the hands of the very people he once ruled over. A bloody end for a bloody reign.